What's up, everybody? It's Greg Peters, and today I'm going to talk about one of the stupidest mistakes, or as I like to refer to it as, one of the biggest learning experiences I've ever been through. I blew up the engine in my NB Miata by doing something that was completely avoidable, and that turned into doing a full VVT engine swap in just 2 days, which I'll also be talking about in this video. All that and more right here on the Car Passion channel. All right, I'm going to cut right to the chase and answer the question that everyone is asking right now, and that is, where the heck did I get these awesome LED signs? And those are from my friends at My LED Neon Design, and they reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in checking out their products, and I said, you know what? If you can get me a pair of your signs that match the Miatas, a green NB and a red NA, you're on. So here they are. They look awesome. They include a remote so you can control the brightness depending on like what kind of room you're putting them in. They have different mounting options. You can run them off a wall outlet or a battery pack. They have all the different Miatas, NA through ND. They just came out with a hardtop version. They also do other cars and custom designs as well. So check them out when you're done with this video. And if you like them, you can save yourself a few bucks by using Car Passion Channel 15 as your coupon code and stylize your room with a couple Miatas. I wasn't sure how I wanted to go about uploading this video because most people would probably not want to get up in front of an audience and say, hey, I made a huge mistake and it was really dumb and avoidable. I just want to let everybody know. But everybody makes mistakes and it's fine. And everyone who I told this story to, instead of being like, oh, wow, that was really stupid, they instead shared a story of their own about how they made a silly mistake that cost them a lot of money or work or both. So what I want you guys to do is down in the comments below, share your biggest learning experience, the most expensive thing or the most labor-intensive thing you've ever caused yourself to have to do, so we can all go through and just kind of read each other's stories, and I think that would be fun to share. Now, I'll warn you in advance that I'm not going to have full production videos on the engine swap, the transmission swap, the subframe swap, and everything, because no matter how it seems, I'm just a normal person, and the green NB is how I get around, and if I were to film full videos the way I normally do, it would have taken at least a month to finish all that, but instead I got it done in 2 days. So hopefully that in itself can provide you guys with some motivation to get out in the garage and get back to work on that project that's been sitting for a month or 3 months or 6 months just because you feel like it's never going to get finished, so you just don't work on it. And one of the biggest things that's helped me in that scenario is just make yourself a checklist and break your project down into much smaller pieces. And I promise, if you just chip away at it, it will get done and you will be out there ripping that car again sooner than you know. Anyways, what the heck did I do to my motor? So it all started with this clip right here. I have a meeting at my work. I have to leave in about 20 minutes. So we're pushing it down to the wire. It's coming down to the wire. I don't even know right now. I just finished putting the rebuilt head onto the engine. It was a Monday morning. I was rushing to get to work and I changed the oil. I buttoned everything up and I left for work. And I pulled out of the driveway. Everything was fine. I went down the block and I was like, kind of it feels like it's down on power a little bit. I wonder if I didn't hook something up right, or I did a little pull up to like 5,000 RPM in first gear and I was like, yeah, it's definitely down on power. So I'm just gonna run back to my house, grab the laptop. I'll take a couple data logs on the way to work and then I can analyze them later and just kind of figure out what's going on with the tune. So I turn around, I'm on my way back to the house and all of a sudden the motor doesn't want to idle. It keeps stalling. I'm like, man, what could I have forgotten to plug in, or what could be going on with this thing? So get back to my driveway and like really won't want to idle and I can barely get into the driveway. And it was at that point that I realized that I drained the oil, but I did not refill the oil. So I just drove the car 2 blocks and then 2 blocks home with no oil in the motor. So I just kind of sat there and I was like, that's not good. So I filled the motor with oil and I was like,
just pretend that didn't happen.
And I drove it to work. And I actually drove the car for a few weeks and it was completely fine until it wasn't. And it developed rod knock, which I can't say I was really surprised when that happened. how the heck could I forget to put oil in the car? I'm a car guy. Car guys don't make mistakes like that. Well, we do, apparently. There were a couple different ways that this happened. Number one, I had the car on jack stands when I was finishing the head replacement, and I drained the oil, and I was like, I'm just gonna drain the oil and change the filter while it's in the air, and then I'll put the splash guard back on, put the car back on the ground, and then I'll fill it up with oil. Got distracted with something, and I just forgot to put oil in the thing, and when I fired it up, another thing that didn't help is I have a CanChecked in place of my oil pressure gauge. So I have no oil pressure gauge, no oil pressure warning light, and I don't have oil pressure hooked up to the CanChecked yet because I've been procrastinating it. So no warnings on the dash, and the motor fired up and idled and ran completely fine. There was not a hint of ticking, knocking, clattering, no weird noises. There was nothing that would cause me to suspect anything was wrong, which was extremely surprising to me. I guess the oil tolerances on those motors are so tight that when there's no oil pressure, it still doesn't knock. But anyways, I mean, it ended up knocking eventually, but it still fired up and ran without making a peep. But even after it developed rod knock, I was thinking to myself, this might work out okay, because I've got to replace the front subframe anyways, which I'll show you why in just a second. While the front subframe is out, I can drop the oil pan, I can find the cylinder that's knocking, and I can replace that rod bearing, or I can replace all the rod bearings, because you can do that with the motor in the car. It's not optimal, but it's possible. And I've even got an extra set of ACL race bearings that might be the right size. Now, the NB was in some kind of relatively serious accident before I bought it. It's got lots of Bondo and some bent things, one thing being the front subframe. So other than the fact that I couldn't really get it to align that well, the problem didn't really surface until I installed the Flying Miata Kogeki wheels. Nothing to do with the wheels, but just the fact that they were wider than what I had on before, and now on the right side of the car, the tire would rub the coilover if I would steer about one full steering wheel turn. So if I had to make a U-turn, I would have to do a 3-point U-turn, which looks pretty silly in a Miata. It's livable, but I wanted to get it fixed. So I bought a subframe from a car that I knew had not been crashed, and I also got a brand new set of upper control arms with ball joints and a set of used lower control arms that I knew were straight. And all I had to do at that point was put all the arms together and put the subframe on and hope that the bolt holes line up, because my fear was that if the car was in a crash, it's possible that the chassis bent and the subframe bent with it. And if I put a straight subframe on, the bolt holes wouldn't line up. But before I could get to that, I had to drop the oil pan and see if the engine was fried or not. My preferred way to drop the front subframe is by using what's called an engine sling or an engine bridge that just sits on top of the fenders. You guys have probably seen it in several of my videos before, and it suspends the engine while you can drop out the front subframe. And to do that, all you do is remove the wheels, remove the brake calipers, unbolt the hubs from the control arms, and then unbolt everything else that connects the car or the engine to the subframe, which would be unbolting the steering rack, which I left in the car so I didn't have to disconnect the power steering lines, unbolt the anti-sway bar, the coilover bottom bolts, and the motor mount nuts. Then you have 4 nuts and 2 bolts that hold the entire front subframe to the chassis, and you can just drop the entire thing out. And I just use 2 floor jacks, or you can use a transmission jack to lower the whole front subframe out with the control arms. You can see how the upper control arm is square with the subframe, and then panning over to the other side, the upper control arm is twisted clockwise, and that's what was causing the coilover to almost contact the arm. And while I have this clip pulled up, I'll go ahead and fast forward to after I completed the subframe swap to show you how perfectly centered the coilover is in that upper arm, and that's exactly how it should look. To make sure that I'm being safe, if I'm working underneath the engine and it's just supported by the engine sling, I always put 2 jack stands at different points underneath the transmission. So if the engine sling were to fail, if the hook were to break or anything like that, the jack stands will support the weight of the drivetrain and it's not going to fall on you, which is not good. Don't just trust the engine sling by itself to hold the motor up. Once the subframe is out, the oil pan is really easy to take off. It's surrounded by a bunch of 10mm bolts, including 2 really long ones at the back of the pan, and then you have to remove the 4 lower transmission bolts. Once those are out, the pan will come off. It's going to be pretty stuck because they use sealant from factory from Mazda, so you'll want to pry it between the block and the pan to get it off, but once it kind of pops loose, the pan will just drop out. And make sure you got to shimmy it a little bit so you're not pulling on the oil pickup because you don't want to bend that tube. But yeah, the pan just drops out. That's it. So how exactly do you tell which cylinder has rod knock? Well, you rotate the engine until, if you have a 4-cylinder, 2 of the connecting rods will be at the very bottom position, and you just grab onto it with your hand and try to move it back and forth. And although from factory there is a clearance there, it's so tight that you're not going to be able to visibly see the connecting rod moving against the crankshaft. Now, a cylinder that has rod knock, you will be able to move it with your hand and see that movement, which you can see in this clip right here. And don't be thrown off if you can move the connecting rod front to back. That play is completely normal. That's just the thrust play. It doesn't have to be super tight, and that's not rod knock. It's the back and forth motion, or what makes the sound is the up and down motion when the engine's actually running that you're looking for. So it only had 1 cylinder that was knocking. That's number 2, and I decided to pull the rod cap off, and no surprise that the bearing is completely fried. But the crank actually looked totally fine, which is a good sign. So I'm thinking at this point, I might be able to just put new rod bearings in this thing and I'll be okay. I took a brand new pair of ACL standard size rod bearings and I installed them with a piece of plastic gauge, which is like this little wax string that you install with the bearing, and you torque down the rod cap or the main cap, whatever bearing you're checking. And then when you pull it off, you will have squished that little wax string, and you use the little ruler that the plastic gauge comes with, and you match it up with that squished wax, and you can tell what the bearing clearance is. And the clearance in this case came right out to 20 10,000ths, which is completely perfect. So I'm still getting pretty excited. The bearings are the right size, and I might be able to get away with just replacing those. But I still have to check the main bearings, which I don't have spares of, but I could get those. Hopefully. I mean, there's like a global bearing shortage right now, but I could still find them. And technically you can replace the main bearings with the engine in the car with just the pan off. It's definitely not the recommended way to do it at all. But at this point, I was completely willing to risk losing a set of bearings rather than having to pull and rebuild the entire engine. So I pulled off the number 3 main cap, and the bearing was not only completely fried with metal like oozing out of the side of it, like when the T1000 got hit with the grenade launcher, but the crankshaft was also very scored. And at that point, if the crankshaft is actually damaged and you put a new set of bearings in it, it's pretty likely that you're just going to fry that new set of bearings very quickly. It's happened to a few of my friends before. I just knew the motor was basically done at that point. So after laying on the concrete and just kind of staring at the car for a while, I went inside, played video games for a half an hour, and then just proceeded to lay on the couch and stare at the ceiling for a while, thinking about what I had done. But then realized that the car's not going to fix itself. So it was at that point that it was really time to get to work. So where did this VVT engine even come from? So about a year ago or so, I was looking for a 6-speed transmission, which I would eventually put into the NB, and I found one for sale from a gentleman named Ricky, who's with the Throttle YouTube channel. Shout out to Ricky. He was selling the 6-speed from his Miata. He also had the VVT engine that came attached to that transmission, and he's like, hey, do you just want to take this engine for free? Also, I don't really have a use for it, and it doesn't start, or it didn't start when it was pulled out of the car. And what happened is it did run, and then it was in his Miata cart, so it was like the engine's very exposed, and the car somehow fell off a trailer. It landed on the crank nose and then it wouldn't start anymore. And then the engine and transmission was pulled out to put some other ludicrous engine into that car.
You can see damage from here. The AC condenser got pushed up. This is the radiator that's completely broken off and ended up hitting the crank pulley. And now it doesn't start, and my prediction is that the crankshaft is done. So I think this thing is done. I'm not gonna rebuild this engine. If I do something, we're gonna end up doing an engine swap on it.
And I assumed that probably what happened is the trigger wheel got bent and the crank sensor wasn't picking it up anymore, but I didn't know for sure. But nonetheless, I figured even if the crankshaft was bent or something, I could at least use the VVT head. So I took the engine home and I transported it in the red car, of course. Let's recap here. I'm about to pull out the engine that is fully fried from my car and replace it with another engine that won't start. What could possibly go wrong? I did want to minimize the amount of work at this point just by leaving the 5-speed in the car, but obviously I changed my mind on that and I was like, you know what? I already have this thing all apart, might as well put the 6-speed in with it, and then I'll have a 6-speed with the VVT swap, and it'll be epic. Removing the engine from the car is just a matter of disconnecting everything that attaches the engine to the chassis itself. In fact, it's very similar to the process that I covered in the head removal video. In fact, it's almost exactly the same. You're removing or disconnecting all the electronics, the fuel system, a couple grounds. I actually unbolted the power steering pump and the AC compressor and just zip tied them out of the way, kind of to the side of the engine bay, so I wouldn't have to disconnect the power steering lines or the AC lines. Again, trying to just work as quickly as possible and get back to having a running car at maximum speed. So I left those systems in the engine bay. I left the alternator on the engine because that's just like a plug. And I pulled the entire engine out of the car. So we're up to Saturday night now. The old engine's out of the car, and I have the new VVT engine and the old engine sitting next to each other in the garage, and I wanted to swap some parts back and forth before I put the VVT engine into the Miata. One of the main things was the fuel system, and even though this isn't really necessary because NB1 and NB2 fuel system is compatible, I knew that the injectors are good in the NB, and I also just resealed the injectors, so I wanted to use that fresh set on the VVT motor. I also, of course, swapped over the square top intake manifold because friends don't let friends use VTCS manifolds. It is by far the worst flowing intake manifold ever put onto a Miata from factory, and I'm still trying to break 150 wheel horsepower with this engine, so of course, square top it is. I also swapped the ignition system over from the BP4W because no matter how simple it is, which I really haven't even looked into it yet, I didn't want to mess with changing any wiring at all to run the coil on plug system from the VVT motor. I knew that I could just plug in the NB1 ignition system and that would be completely fine. I wouldn't have to mess with anything. The only thing that's kind of wonky is the ignition coils are just zip tied to the back of the head because with the VVT feed line, you can't just bolt on the ignition coils from an NB1 onto an NB2 motor. And then the final thing was just swapping over the crank pulley and the trigger wheel from the motor that came out of the car onto the new motor because, again, I knew it was good and I also suspected that that's what was causing the no start problem. And then the lightweight clutch and flywheel, of course, I swapped over as well. And by the end of the night, around midnight on Saturday, I had the fresh VVT motor ready to drop into the NB. Sunday morning, I started working on the transmission swap bits. So I just dropped the 5-speed out of the NB. And if you're doing a 5-speed to 6-speed swap in an NB1 or an NB2, it's like the easiest 6-speed swap to do out of all of the Miatas. Even though putting a 6-speed into like a 1.6 is very easy, if you're doing it in an NB, it's the easiest. You don't have to change any connectors around. Everything matches up. The main things that I did are swap the speed sensor from my 5-speed into the 6-speed because the 6-speed came out of a car that had a 3.9 diff and my car has a 4.3 diff, so I wanted to use the 4.3 speed sensor, and that makes the speedometer accurate. And then I just swapped over the boots from my fresh shifter rebuild so I could have that nice setup with the new trans. Oh yeah, and I also stole the AWR motor mounts from the NA build to put on the NB motor because the stock motor mounts were just completely exploded, so I'll have to get a new set of those for the NA as well. But that's no big deal because the NA is still going to be down for a while. I have quite a bit of work to do to kind of get that car back up to where I'm satisfied with it and it's really ready for its new engine, which is I also haven't even started building yet. So, but anyways, that's for future videos. Now, for the first time, I decided to put the engine and transmission together on the ground and put the whole thing as one unit into the Miata. And I know there are a lot of people who are big fans of doing it this way. And I will say, even though it was my first time doing it, it was very easy to do. It definitely helped to have two people. Bree was able to control the position of the crane while I controlled the angle of the engine and transmission. But once you get it started to snake into the tunnel, man, that whole thing just drops right in, and you can start getting it hooked up to the PPF and start to get it all straightened up. There are a lot of people out there that say even if you're just going to change your clutch, it's easier to pull the whole system out, change the clutch with everything out of the car, put it together and put it back in. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that because there is still quite a bit of work involved with getting everything disconnected and pulling the engine and everything out of the car. I probably still prefer to do a clutch only on the ground, but it's definitely not that bad to do it all as one unit. So at this point, I made myself a quick checklist of everything I could think of that the car needed to be 100% completed and road ready. And what was on the top of that list? Add oil. Let's not forget this time, okay? So by Sunday night, everything was 99% ready to go. The only real change I needed to make to use the VVT engine was I had to extend the harness for the cam angle sensor because the NB1 engine has the cam angle sensor at the front and it uses the cam gear. And in order for the ECU to know what the VVT angle is, it has to take the reading off of the camshaft itself because the camshaft position changes in relation to the cam gear. So it needs to see actually where the cam is. So I built a little crank angle extension harness and man, I'm so proud of how that came out. It has to be like the best looking piece of harness that I've ever built. And I wouldn't have been able to do it so well without the awesome wiring courses from my friends at HP Academy. So I've been taking a bunch of the wiring courses from HP Academy and man, I'm learning so much on every video, just all about soldering versus crimping and the different types of heat shrink wrap and different wiring gauges and when to use what. It's really awesome because wiring in a car is probably the thing that intimidates me the most, and I'm the worst at it. I'm always wondering like how to properly ground things and where to pull power sources from and what gauge wiring to use and do I solder or use crimp connectors. And a lot of times I end up with like a rat's nest of wiring that's sort of just an afterthought and it just gets literally pushed under the rug so you can't see it. And I'm like, well, it works, but for how long? But I've been making some big improvements to my wiring skill. And if you guys want to check out any of HP Academy's courses, I will link them down below in the description. You can use the coupon code CARPASSION50 to save $50 off of your first purchase at HP Academy. In my opinion, it's always money well spent to be able to better yourself at any hobby you're undertaking, this one being building race cars and high-performance street cars, and you're also supporting the Car Passion channel at the same time, so I greatly appreciate it. And now, back to the engine swap. Okay, where was I? So, things that you have to change to put the VVT engine in your car. Got the harness extension. As far as the tune is concerned, on a standalone ECU, you don't have to touch anything in the tune if you did it the way that I did. And there's actually a lot of confusion on swapping engines from different years of Miatas. 99% of the time, it's your best option to leave the wiring harness and the ECU in the car that originally came with that car. There's a lot of chatter online about like, oh, I want to swap my engine, but it seems like a nightmare to do a wiring harness swap. And yeah, I avoid wiring harness swaps at all costs, but you really don't need to do that ever, even if you're running a stock ECU. Think about it this way. The ECU really doesn't have any idea of what's mechanically going on with the engine. It really only reads electronic signals, so it doesn't know if the engine's a 1.6 or a 1.8. But especially in the case of the stock ECU, what it does need to see are all of the sensors it was originally designed to run with. So let's use the case of a very popular swap, which is putting a BP4W or an NB1 engine into a 1.6 car. You can do it with the original wiring harness and the stock 1.6 ECU, as long as you're using the 1.6 liter AFM, the O2 sensor, the idle speed control valve, the throttle position sensor, and you'll even use your 1.6 CAS. And that way the ECU it just thinks there's a stock engine in the car. You can't go too much bigger on the injectors, but you can use the NB injectors, and then you'll use an NB1 fuel rail, and I think something about an NA8 fuel pressure regulator, but flipped upside down. Basically, you have to run a return type fuel system on the engine. But I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here. I just kind of wanted to cover that because there's so much confusion about swapping engines and ECUs and stuff. And if you're on a standalone, you definitely keep the wiring harness and the ECU for the year of your chassis. The year of the engine doesn't matter. You can change sensors and configure things to work properly. And if you put a VVT engine in a car that didn't come with it and you use a stock ECU, obviously the ECU is not going to be able to control the VVT. In fact, you won't even hook it up because there's no point. But you're not going to be losing any horsepower. You're just going to be losing a bunch of mid-range torque, but it's still fine. In fact, I've been running the car without VVT for the last couple weeks, and it still has plenty of power up top. It's just a little bit lackluster in the mid-range, but you can either get something like a VV tuner or go to a standalone later to get that all figured out. Okay, back on topic. Let's fire up, or at least attempt to fire up, this VVT engine swap for the first time. Oh boy. All right, I got all my engine related things checked off, including putting oil in the motor. I don't know why I'm nervous right now. There's really no reason this engine shouldn't run. It did come out of a car that ran, but then didn't run. But I put all the systems from the BP4W on it, including the injectors, all as much harness stuff as I could. No red flags, man. Even the ignition system from the BP4W, so everything should fire up. Everything is all go, except for the VVT is not hooked up, obviously. What the heck? Let's give it a fire and see what happens. Okay. So I have a running car again. In fact, I went from having a running-ish car on Friday when I started the subframe swap to having a running car on Monday morning, and I'm pretty gosh dang proud of that. Also, shout out again to Ricky with Throttle for giving me his engine for free. I would venture to say that the car is actually running better than it ever has. But we're gonna find out when I get to the dyno. Driving impressions, the very first thing I notice is the gearing is incredibly short. I've actually never driven a Miata with a 6-speed and a 4.3, and man, it is crazy short. But I'd say for anything that's naturally aspirated and under maybe 180 horsepower or so, it's perfect. It's really easy to keep the engine in the power band, and it's just generally fun. Well, power band. It's, it's a Miata, so you know how that goes. But you get the point. It is, however, not good for road trips or long highway cruises. I think at 75 miles an hour, I'm at 4,300 RPM, so that bad boy's buzzing. But that's not what I own the car for. It's designed to just be a fun car, kind of like the red car, I guess, but a very, very slow version of that. As far as power, the new motor does feel a little bit soft. I did a virtual dyno and it showed 128 wheel horsepower compared to the BP4W that, when it was healthy, showed 136, but I did pull a bunch of timing out of the timing map, so I'm sure that's it. The VVT engines do have a little bit more compression. They're 10-1 compared to 9.5-1, and I didn't want to run like the full-on tuned timing map that I had on the old motor, so I just pulled a bunch of timing out of it, and it also doesn't have VVT yet, which isn't going to affect peak power, but it will certainly affect the mid-range. And I'll be covering some stuff about VVT tuning and what kind of gains you can see with and without VVT once I actually get the car on the dyno again. So that's my update. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions about the stuff that I talked about in this video, drop them in the comments below, or tell me your story about how you accidentally messed up something on your car. I'd love to hear some stories from you guys. As far as the NB is concerned, I'm just going to continue it as I normally would have. I'm still going to try to break that 150 wheel horsepower barrier with just bolt-ons and tuning. I'm still going to install the nitrous system on the stock motor as I was planning on doing, and we're just going to continue on. So I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for checking in and watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.